Okie dokie, good morning and welcome to our discussion of Chapter 5, Concepts of Biology. Today we are talking about photosynthesis. Um, Photosynthesis is overall a process that most organisms um, on Earth use to make sunlight into sugar, which then forms into energy. Um, most things Most living things on this planet are dependent on this photosynthesis process, whether you think about it or not. So, a little bit of an overview about photosynthesis. In this chapter, we will summarize the process of photosynthesis, we're going to explain the relevance of photosynthesis to other living things, identify the reactants and products, and kind of describe some of the main structures. So ultimately, all of our energy, whether we only eat plants or whether we eat animal protein, no matter what, essentially all of our energy comes from the sun. Okay. Um, all of the producers that generate their own energy, we'll later call them autotrophs, will get their energy from the sun. Remember, energy is something that can be neither created nor destroyed. Okay. As we know, all living organisms have one or more cells, and each of those cells are going to run on chemical energy, mainly in carbohydrates. Okay. And those carbohydrates are formed by the process of photosynthesis, at least in our autotrophs. And I'll explain what autotrophs are in just a minute. Okay. So through that process of photosynthesis, certain organisms or producers or autotrophs will convert solar energy into chemical energy. Okay. So that's the energy from the sun. Don't make fun of my little son. Okay. He's doing his best and he's cute. Okay. To chemical energy. I'll just draw a little beaker or something there. Okay. Which is then used to build carbohydrates. This is just not to scale of a glucose, okay? So the energy that holds these molecules together is released when the organism breaks down that food. We talked about that hydrolysis versus dehydration reaction, and some energy is stored in some of those bonds. Okay, and then the cells use that energy to perform work such as things like cellular respiration and other things that they need to make sure that they are functioning and doing what they need to do. Okay. So some organisms that can do photosynthesis, we've got plants, that makes sense. Those are the ones that we know about that definitely do photosynthesis. Algae tend to do a lot of photosynthesis. Algae, you can find those in like relatively still waters, things like that. You've seen an algae bloom. And then we also have what we call cyanobacteria. I can't spell, sorry. Cyanobacteria. Okay, and cyanobacteria are a special type of bacteria cells that are capable of doing photosynthesis. They are called photoautotrophs. Okay? So what is an autotroph? We've just talked about photoautotrophs, but what the heck is an autotroph? Oops. An autotroph is something that can feed itself. Auto means self, troph means feeder. So an autotroph is just a self-feeder. Okay. Autotrophs can produce their own food. They don't need to eat something else to make that energy. There are different types of autotrophs or different ways that these autotrophs can make energy. One of them includes photoautotrophs. Photoautotrophs use light to make their own energy. Photoautotrophs specifically use the sun's energy to make carbohydrates. Okay. So those are photoautotrophs. The last one that we kind of talk about are heterotrophs. Hetero means other. Troph, again, still means feeder. So heterotrophs obtain energy and carbon from food by consuming other organisms. So that's anything that eats anything else is going to be a heterotroph. So most animals are going to be heterotrophs. Most mammals are heterotrophs, things like that. Okay. Later on in the semester, we're going to talk about kind of like the food pyramid and the different ways that different consumers will get their food, but that's a later conversation. Okay. So, for example, these deer get their energy from eating the grass, right? They eat the grass got its energy from the sun, the deer get their energy from the grass, and then whatever eats these deer get their energy from that. Okay. So if you really think about it, that last guy is definitely still going to get his energy from the sun because that energy is neither created nor destroyed, it is just modified. Okay. Again, in the human diet, we eat food that is grown usually or produced, manufactured, that has carbon. That carbon gets transferred to us via these different processes that we'll kind of talk about over the next couple of lessons. Generally, photosynthesis is where the sunlight and carbon dioxide and water release oxygen and make sugar. So sun plus CO2 plus H2O equals oxygen and glucose. Okay, so that's very basically the overview of photosynthesis. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about the molecules that go into photosynthesis. So the process of photosynthesis can be represented by this equation in which, like I said, carbon dioxide and water make sugar and oxygen. So this process uses about 6 carbon dioxides, 6 water molecules, to make one sugar molecule and 6 oxygen molecules. Okay. For your purposes for this class, I would just know this equation and be able to kind of see it in multiple different ways. Okay. So photosynthesis does not get carried out by every single leaf in a cell, or every single cell in a leaf. Usually it's just the cells in the middle layer of the leaf that have those chloroplasts. That is called, the area that is called the mesophyll. So that photosynthesis will generally take place in the mesophyll. Okay. Kind of the more middle part of the cell. Right? Some important locations that you should know about photosynthesis. So one, it happens in the mesophyll in those chloroplasts. Remember, those are the main cells of the, or main energy cells of the plants. Okay. So autotrophs will make their energy from the sun and turn it into chemical energy and build those molecules from that. That is essentially what photosynthesis is. Now we're going to talk more about the process of photosynthesis and how that energy development takes place. But before we get into that, there's some things that you need to know that I think will help your understanding of how light plays a role in this reaction. So we think about light as waves. Light energy, we think about it in waves. The waves of light have both a crest, that's the very top of the wave, and a trough. The longer and more stretched out a wave is, the less energy it has. Okay, so a wave that is pretty short and all together like that, that's going to be a very high energy wave. Okay, humans are able to see light on what we call the visible electromagnetic light spectrum. Different wavelengths of light move differently. Obviously, like I was kind of saying, those really long waves with low energy, generally those will be things that we cannot see. The spectrum of light that is visible to humans is very, very small. There's not a ton of visible light waves that we can see, but the ones that we can, we refer to them as the visible light. Okay. Within that visible light, there is a spectrum of colors that we can see, and they range from red being the lowest energy to kind of bluish purple being high energy. Okay. So these different wavelengths will show the different characteristics of that energy. Plants will also have some light absorbing pigments. For the most part, the one that we will talk about is chlorophyll. Chlorophyll absorbs every light except green. So the green that you see on plants is actually the reflection of that unabsorbed light from that chlorophyll. Okay. Different plants will have different pigment molecules, and so that's why sometimes you'll see plants that are kind of yellowish, sometimes they're red in hue, things like that. So different molecules will have different wavelengths that they absorb and don't absorb, but for the most part, chlorophyll is going to absorb all of the lights except for green light. Okay. Now that we've kind of talked about light and how that works, we can start talking about the two parts of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is broken down into two parts. The first is the light dependent reactions, the second is the light independent reactions, or the Calvin cycle. Okay, so the light-dependent reaction takes place in the thylakoid membrane of the chloroplasts. Those chloroplasts will absorb energy from the sun, convert it into chemical energy with the use of water, and we'll get into how that all happens. Okay, but oxygen is a byproduct of that reaction. Then the Calvin cycle will come in and use that energy from the light-dependent reaction to make sugars. How does all of this happen? Let's talk about it. So, in the simplest way that I can kind of explain this, light will travel to a photosystem, specifically photosystem 2, as a photon. A photon is just a little packet of light energy. Okay, so that's a packet of light. The photon will then excite a bunch of the electrons that are hanging out in this chlorophyll. Okay, that electron will then say, okay, I don't want to be here anymore. You guys are not high energy enough for me, so I'm going to dip. Okay, so one of those electrons will start going about its day, doing what it wants to do. It's going to travel to the primary electron acceptor. And we'll talk about what happens when it gets there. Okay, so this electron, you can imagine that this electron is gone. Bye-bye. In order for this process to continue happening, that electron that went bye-bye needs to be replaced. It gets replaced by the splitting of a water molecule. So that H2O will then split. You will get half of an O2, which is just one singular oxygen molecule, but we don't like to think about oxygen in just a singular because that's a radical, but that's a different conversation. So imagine there's two water molecules. We split that, we get a whole O2 molecule, and we get 4 hydrogen molecules. And those 4 hydrogen molecules and that oxygen then hang out in the thylakoid space. Keep that in mind. It's going to come back later. Okay. In the process of that water molecule splitting apart, the electrons on that oxygen get donated back to the chlorophyll so that it is replaced and the process can start all over again. Okay. After the electron that got excited by the light packet leaves the chloroplast to get to the primary electron acceptor, it will then move along a series of proteins. These proteins are called the electron transport chain. There are 3 proteins in the first photosystem. Okay. The first one is this POPQH2. The second one is the cytochrome complex. And then the third one is this PO protein. Okay. So from this photosystem 2, I don't know why this turned green, but photosystem 2, that electron will pass through each of these proteins, and the energy from that electron activates a pump that shoves hydrogens into the thylakoid space from the stroma of the chloroplasts. Okay, so the stroma is the outside of chloroplast. That thylakoid membrane, then you have the thylakoid space, which is the inside of chloroplast. Okay. By the time it's gotten through all three of those proteins, that electron is pretty low on energy. So it will then go to another photosystem complex where it will get re-energized by another photon packet. Okay. Now it's another high energy, it's the same electron, but it's now high energy again. Okay. It moves through another couple of proteins, this FD protein, and then into this NADP plus reductase. That NADP plus reductase will take a molecule of NADP plus and a hydrogen ion and turn it into NADPH. NADPH is an electron carrier. I don't even want to say electron. It is an energy carrier. Remember all that sunlight into chemical energy? This is that chemical energy. Okay. All of those protons, those hydrogens that got pumped into the thylakoid space, will then get used to activate this ATP synthase protein, which will make ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and a phosphate ion into ATP, which is another energy carrier. Okay? Those two energy carriers will then get transported to the next step, which is the Calvin cycle. Okay? So the electron from that chloroplast goes through a bunch of proteins, photosystem 1, photosystem 2, and eventually will form NADPH and ATP. Okay. So that light dependent reaction, because it is dependent on the light coming in and exciting the electrons in the chloroplasts, then makes the energy molecules ATP and ADPH that travel into the stroma where the Calvin cycle will then take place. Okay. When we talk about the Calvin cycle, we talk about it in three phases. The first phase is fixation. The second is reduction. And then the third is regeneration. And the molecules that play a big role in the Calvin cycle are carbon dioxide, an enzyme called rubisco, and a 5-carbon molecule called RUBP. Okay? In this Calvin cycle, 3 molecules of CO2 and 3 molecules of RUBP are fixed together using that enzyme rubisco. Okay? That will eventually make 6 molecules of 3-PGA. Okay? That's just a 3-carbon molecule, 3-carbon intermediate molecule that we talk about. Okay? That 3, I'm going to move over here so I have a little bit more space. Okay? That 3-PGA will use Remember, there's 6 of them. So each of them will use the energy from an ATP and make it an ADP, as well as the energy from the NADPH and make that into NAD plus and hydrogen, okay, to make 6 molecules of G3P. Okay, G3P is a higher energy molecule. It has more potential energy. Okay. From those 6 molecules of G3P, one, what color should I do? One of them will go into building your sugar. The other 5 will go into regenerating. Remember, that's regenerating, that last step, your RUBP. Okay? From this whole process, one G3P goes into making your glucose. So this Calvin cycle has to happen 6 times in order to make glucose, in order to make a sugar. Okay? That RUBP must be recreated so that the whole process can start over again. Some plants have had to adapt this Calvin cycle, and it evolves some reactions outside of the Calvin cycle that help to conserve water and energy. But again, like I said, in biology, we have our always, but our always has exceptions. Okay, so these different variations can come into play with unfavorable weather conditions, such as this cactus. Cactuses are great at holding onto water, so they don't necessarily use that water for energy like the Calvin cycle. Photosynthetic prokaryotes do a similar mechanism, but it's not exactly the same thing. Because they don't have all of the organelles that make this happen, they produce these thylakoid um, folds, that do all of the necessary parts of photosynthesis. The overall reaction of photosynthesis is as follows. 6 CO2s plus 6 H2Os gets you 1 sugar and 6 oxygen molecules. You notice that the reaction for cellular respiration is the same thing but in reverse. 6 oxygen molecules plus sugar equals CO2 and water, right? So plants make oxygen, animals make CO2. Aminals, we're going with it. And that's pretty consistent with what you know and what you have learned throughout your life. It's this mutual process of animals consuming oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide, and plants consuming that carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen.